Well, it's not Donald Trump who did this. It's the 63 million people who voted for Donald Trump and put the power of Supreme Court nominations in Donald Trump's hands for 4 years. And it's the 62 million people who voted for George W. Bush, or who volunteered for his campaign, or who helped out in any way, which meant that they indirectly voted for Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote the opinion overturning Roe versus Wade. And it's the 49 million people who voted for George H.W. Bush, who indirectly voted for Clarence Thomas to serve on the Supreme Court, where he waited for decades to vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. Now, many of those Republican voters did not mean for this to happen. Most voters had every right to suspect that Donald Trump's position on abortion as a presidential candidate was just political posturing. He wasn't the first. George H.W. Bush and the Bush family were supporters of Planned Parenthood until George H.W. Bush had to change his position in 1980 in order to become Ronald Reagan's vice presidential running mate. An act of ultimate cynicism in politics. No one working in American politics believed that George H.W. Bush from Connecticut was really opposed to abortion. It's simply what he had to say to get on the Republican ticket, which in that year was running on an anti-abortion platform that the candidates never emphasized, but made sure that anti-abortion voters knew about. It was the most cynical public act we had yet seen in presidential or vice presidential candidate. The first of President Bush's sons did not have to engage in a public reversal of his position. By the time he became a politician running for governor of Texas, George W. Bush fully aligned himself with the absolute anti-abortion politics of the Republican Party that had taken hold by that time in the 1990s. The next presidential campaigning Republican, forced by Republican politics, not by principle, to get in line with the party on abortion was Mitt Romney, who ran a losing Senate campaign in Massachusetts against Ted Kennedy, claiming to be to the left of Ted Kennedy on abortion and other issues. Then Mitt Romney won the governorship of Massachusetts, running with the identical position on abortion of every Democrat in Massachusetts. Mitt Romney was completely pro-choice as the governor of Massachusetts, and then when he ran for president as a Republican in 2012, he completely flip-flopped and became as anti-abortion as any other Republican. So when Donald Trump says, as he did this week, that the Republican position on abortion is just politics, he means it. And he's not the first one. He's not the first one to think so cynically about Republican abortion politics. The last time Republican presidential candidates debated abortion was 24 years ago, when John McCain wanted to ban all abortions with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother, and George W. Bush didn't appear to understand his own no exceptions position.
George, do you believe in the exemption in abortion, case for abortion for rape, incest, and life of the mother?
I do.
Then, you know, it's interesting. You were talking about printed material that's mailed out. Here's one that says that George W. Bush supports the pro-life plank. Pro-life plank, yes. So, in other words, your position is that you believe there's an exemption for rape, incest, and life of the mother, but you want the platform that you're supposed to be leading to have no exemption.
Yeah, but the platform, I will.
Thank
the platform talks about, it doesn't talk about what specifically should be in the constitutional amendment.
No, it doesn't have the exemptions in it, and you know that very well.
Let me finish. The platform speaks about a constitutional amendment. It doesn't refer to how that constitutional amendment ought to be defined. George, it does not, John.
You read the platform, it has no exceptions.
John, I think we need to keep the platform the way it is. This is a pro-life party.
Then you were contradictory.
May I finish, please? May I finish, please? Right. Please. We need to be a pro-life party. We need to say life is precious. And that's what our platform refers to. And that's why we need to leave it the same.
George W. Bush, the man who became president, clearly did not know what he was talking about. John McCain didn't either. During that campaign, John McCain was asked by a reporter if he would tell his then 15-year-old daughter that she could not have an abortion if she became pregnant. John McCain said, no, I would discuss this issue with Cindy and Megan, and this would be a private decision that we would share within our family. Obviously, I would encourage her to know that that baby would be brought up in a loving family. The final decision would be made by Megan with our advice and counsel, and I think that's such a private matter. Yeah, it is a private matter. All responsible people agreed with that answer. But that was not actually John McCain's position as a candidate, and that meant that John McCain was in favor of banning abortion for everyone except his daughter. So John McCain was forced to go into Republican damage control, calling reporters saying, I misspoke. What I believe I was saying and intended to say is this is a family decision. The family decision will be made by the family, not by Megan alone. That clarified nothing, of course, except that Republican elected officials, especially presidential candidates, do not mean what they say about abortion. They never have. They have always been posturing, and none of them ever wanted to deal with the reality of their position on abortion, which we are now dealing with, and the people of Arizona are dealing with tonight, having been thrown back to 1864 to live by a law written by one man who no one elected to anything, back when Arizona was a territory, a half-century away from becoming a state. Make America great again now means make America great the way it was in 1864, when the territory of Arizona was fighting on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War to preserve slavery in America and imposing laws on women and doctors and nurses that everyone in Arizona has to live with tonight. The Democrats in the state legislature in Arizona tried to repeal that law today, and the Republicans blocked it. And so the Republicans in Arizona actively made the decision today that the people in Arizona must live as if it were 1864 and it wasn't even a state. And so reporters can and should hound Donald Trump on the campaign trail about the 5-year prison sentences that doctors and nurses and support staff and drivers are facing in Arizona now. But you should also stand outside George W. Bush's home in Texas and demand an answer from him. Is this what he wanted when he chose Samuel Alito for the Supreme Court? Or was George W. Bush just playing the game of abortion politics, just like every Republican did before him? The game was never to win. The game was to keep the game going. If you were anti-abortion, you had to vote for Republicans as long as they kept the game going, because they were the only ones who were at least pretending they wanted to stop it. Secretly, Republican politicians didn't want abortion to stop, because then you wouldn't have to vote for them anymore to stop abortion. You wouldn't have to contribute money to their campaigns. You couldn't ask for a more powerful lesson in how much your vote matters and how long your vote matters. Your vote lives after you, long after you. Millions of people who voted for George H.W. Bush and who therefore voted for Clarence Thomas to be on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade are now dead. Millions of those voters have been dead for decades. Their vote continues to live after them in the hands of Clarence Thomas on the United States Supreme Court. It didn't seem like a life-changing election in 1988 when Michael Dukakis was running against George H.W. Bush. I didn't know anyone who thought the country was going to take a major turn for the worse because of the outcome of that election. The stakes seemed about as low as they could get in a presidential election. But as I've said before on this program repeatedly, whenever the stakes appear low in a presidential election, you always have to remember the United States Supreme Court. And so, for the Democratic voters who just weren't excited enough about Michael Dukakis or the Republican voters who voted for a guy who used to support Planned Parenthood. The truth is that at that time they couldn't possibly have known they were going to change life in America profoundly decades later with their vote for George H.W. Bush, or the decision simply not to vote. Same thing in 2000, when George W. Bush was running against Al Gore. The stakes did not seem high. That's why enough people voted for Ralph Nader as a third-party candidate in Florida to give the Electoral College, thanks to the Supreme Court decision, to George W. Bush. Bush, from the Connecticut Bush family, who pretended to be Texans. He couldn't be a real hardcore Texas conservative, could he? The stakes couldn't be that high. It turns out a vote for George W. Bush was a vote for Samuel Alito to take a seat on the Supreme Court and 20 years later write the opinion overturning Roe versus Wade. And so, yes, you can and should blame Donald Trump, but you should have to blame the people who voted for Donald Trump for president in 2016, and you have to blame the voters who voted for George W. Bush and the voters who voted for George H.W. Bush before that, because if Michael Dukakis had won, or if Al Gore had won, then Donald Trump could have put 3 right-wing judges on the Supreme Court, and they still wouldn't have a majority. For the voters who voted for Joe Biden 4 years ago and are no longer with us, because they were lost to COVID or cancer or other illness, their votes are going to live after them for probably another 30 years that Ketanji Brown Jackson will serve on the United States Supreme Court. Your vote will live after you. It will live in the Supreme Court. Your vote will live on in the hands of federal judges in their 40s, appointed by Joe Biden, who will serve for another 40 years. Your vote will decide what century we live in. Will we live in an age of legal and constitutional enlightenment, or will we live in 1864? Your vote is not just about the next 4 years. The importance of your vote has never been more clear. Not just as a vote to preserve democracy in this country. We already knew about that. Your vote for who chooses Supreme Court justices is nothing less than an exercise in incredible intergenerational power that will live long after you.